So far, all the games we've created have had one scene. In this tutorial, we're just going to create an intro scene for the DuckShoot game. So if we go to the scenes folder, we see we've just got the one scene here. So I'm just going to create a new scene. So here we can just create a new scene and call this intro. Or anything you like, of course. Now, to switch from one scene to another, make sure that the scene you're actively on is saved, so it shouldn't have a star there, and then we can click on our new scene. Now, many intro scenes just consist of a user interface, so I'm going to do that straight away. So we'll create a user interface for this. So go to here, and I'm going to put an image on the screen. Set it so it's going to be centered, that's fine, and we're looking for the particular source image here. So I do have some images which I will import. So I do have a splash image here. So if we go to that image, and we'll set it to that particular image. So we click here, and we've got the splash screen. And I think I'll make that larger than that. So what I'll do is I'll set it to the native size, and there we are. Now, one of the main purposes of this is to allow the user to click on the button next, and you can put other things in here like your name as the author, whatever you want to do. Now, the important thing is to be able to go on from this image onto the next one. So I'm going to insert a button as well. And I think I'll put this underneath. So there. And just move it up a bit. Let's home in on it. There we go. And I think I'll increase the size of that. And then, of course, the button will have text. There we are. I think we might even add a little bit of special effects to this button. So, for example, on the button we can add an effect. So on the user interface, we've got effects that we can add. So let's have a shadow here. Now we might be able to see it on the actual preview here, but we won't see it. It's a bit too big. Right, so we've got the shadow on there. Here's the color of the shadow. That's okay. So I'm going to increase the X distance. So you should be able to see the shadow there. And the Y distance I'm going to increase by going negative. So zooming out on that. There, we should be able to see the shadow there. Now then, we're going to need to be able to activate this button somehow. So if we also include in the intro an object, I'll call this scene control or scene controller. And like the game controller, the main purpose of this is to hold a script, so I shall do that. And I'm going to call this scene control. Now, what I'll need to be able to do is to use this button to load the next scene. So here's our empty script. So I will need to have in the scene management here, Unity engine, scene management. Okay, so I will need a reference to that button. As usual, I'm going to put it in as a game object. I'm going to call this play button. And I'm going to provide it with a function. So it's going to be public, so I can call it from the button. I'm going to call this void play game. And all this is going to do is ask the scene manager to load the scene. And I've called my main scene main. If you've called your scene something else, put the name in front of it like that. Right. So there's nothing really much to do on there, so I'll just save it. And then go back to Unity. And I need to attach that to this button, which I should call play button. Okay, so as usual, we've got the on click. So I'm going to choose the object, which is going to be the scene controller. And I'm going to find the function which is in our script called scene control. Play game. Now, let's save that scene. Now, to be able to link these scenes together, we have to add them into the build. So here on the file, we've got the build settings. We need to add open scenes, and this has to be in the sequence I want them to run. So here we've got the intro scene, and I also want to build in the main scene. So I'll double click on it to switch to main scene, and then on file, build settings, I'll add this as the open scene. So now we go to the intro and then the main. And so I just go back to the intro and we'll just check that out. Bit on the large side there. Okay, there we go. And I can click on this button now, and then it plays the next scene. That works fine. It's a bit sparse, isn't it? So one of the nice things to be able to do is to fade things in. And to do that, I'm going to add in another thing to the canvas. Just open up the canvas here. And I'm going to add in another user interface. This is a raw image. Now, a raw image doesn't have any particular image on it. It's just there, raw. I'm going to call this screen shader. Now, this image I want to stretch across the screen. So just here, if I hold the Shift and Alt, down here we've got this stretch icon here, which means stretch it to the width and height of the screen. So there's my screen image. That's my screen shader. I'm going to change the color of that to something more in keeping with the flavor of the game. So there we go. A nice dark blue, I think. Now, before we go into scripting this, notice that all colors have got a red, green, blue, and alpha channel. Now, the alpha controls the transparency or opacity. So I could drag this down. As you can see, that's the opacity goes down to 0, and I can see what's underneath it. So I'm going to start with that, with the opacity up to the full. The other thing you need to realize is that in a canvas, the further down the list an object is, the closer it is to the player. So the screen shades are in front of everything. So it's no good there, of course. So what I'll need to do is improve the script so that the screen shader fades in. Let's go back to our script. And I'm going to add something else in here. So again, this is going to be public. And it's going to be a raw image. Oh, sorry, I need to add in the user interface here. Right, so now it should recognize the raw image. I'm going to call this shader. Now, essentially, I'll need a routine to fade it in and fade it out. And I want this to be using time, so it's time dependent. So in that case, I need to return control to the game when I'm not actually fading in. So this means it's going to be a coroutine. So I'll call this fade in. Now, essentially, what I need to do is to get at the color of that shader. So I'm going to create a private reference to this. So, and I'm going to call this shade. And at the beginning of this, I'm going to get this shader and find the color from that. So shade equals shader dot color. Right, so now we've got a reference to that particular color that we're using. Now, to fade in, all I need to do is to gradually change the alpha of that color. So I'm going to create a little loop here. And I'm going to use a for loop, which is a fixed iteration loop. It goes around things at a particular time. So I need to create a variable of the integer type. And I'm going to do this in steps of 10. So I'm going to start it off with 0. And then we're going to keep going as long as c is less than 10. And each time between it, I'm going to increase c by 1. So that's c++. So that sets up a loop to go around things 10 times. Now, as I'm going to fade this in, I'm going to take a copy as I'm going to fade this in, I'm going to take the shader color and reduce its alpha. So here we go, shader, which is the color, no, so shade, and here we've got the alpha component, and I'm going to reduce that by 0.1 floating, and I'm going to insert that color into the shader. And then I'm going to pause for a little bit. So this is why it's a coroutine. And I'm not going to take very long. So if it's in 10 steps, then if I do it 0.1 seconds here, it'll be 1 second for the fade in. So that should fade it in by reducing the alpha. The fade out is going to be very similar. The only difference is we're going to increase the alpha. So I'm going to make sure that we start off with 0, and then I'm going to create this loop again. So it's so similar, I'm just going to copy what I've got here, and I'm going to paste it in here and just change that to plus. So that should start with the shade of it, the alpha of shade to be 0, in other words completely transparent, and then it should increase it a bit. Right, so that's the basic routines to shade it. Now, one of the things is that although it's transparent, it's still over everything else. So we'll find if we use it like this, then the button is not available. So what I'm going to do is, after we've faded it in completely, I'm going to disable it. So shader, I'm going to change its enable property, and that actually disables it so we can get at whatever's underneath it. And of course we want to do the opposite here. So I'm going to enable it here as soon as we've started it. I think perhaps I should have started by making sure that our alpha is turned right up at the beginning of here. Right, so all we need to do now is to start these coroutines. So as soon as we start, we'll start the whole thing going on. So start the coroutine. Fade in. That should fade in. It might be a good idea to actually give a little pause before we fade in, just for everything to settle down. So I'll put another quick so we'll just wait for 1 second before we start to to fade in. Right, so that should fade it in and then disable the shader. What we want to do here is, as soon as we've clicked the button to play the scene, we're going to start the coroutine to fade out. Right, it's getting a little more complex now, but that should be all right. Let's just check the code, as it's a little more complicated than it was before. And we seem to be all right. And back to Unity. And now we'll actually have to make reference to these particular items. So we've got the play button. Let's put that in. It's still importing. There we go. It's the play button, and the screen shader is our shader. Let's save that. And try it out. So there's our fade in, and we should be able to click the button. Oh, that seemed to go rather quickly there, so let me just check that code. Perhaps I'll just leave it to give another second. Here as well. So at the end of our fade out, we'll just wait for a second before giving up on that. Let's check it. Very nice. And we'll try it again. So there's our 1 second delay before fading in. Okay. Okay, I'm going to put this scene, this particular instruction, inside that fade out, and then we'll ensure that it works in there. I'm just going to cut it out of here. And I'm going to pop it into the fade out routine here. Let's save that. Let's see if that does the job. Okay, we've got our 1 second fade in. Click the button. Okay, very good. That's how you get an intro scene.